Welcome, the most captivating science fiction stories where mystery, action, and love intertwine are here. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. The proximity alarm screamed through research station Kepler 7 at exactly 3:47 hours, dragging Captain Malik Akafar from the first decent sleep he'd had in 3 weeks. He rolled out of his narrow bunk with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent too many years responding to emergencies in the black between stars, his feet hitting the cold deck plates before his brain fully processed what was happening. "Newton, report," he called to the station's AI as he stumbled toward the command center, pulling on a rumpled duty shirt. "Good morning, Captain, and what a morning it is. I'm detecting one badly damaged vessel on an intercept course with our lovely little station. The ship appears to be held together by hope, determination, and what I can only assume is an extraordinary amount of prayer to various deities." Malik squinted at the main display, where the approaching craft looked more like flying debris than any recognizable vessel design. Life signs. One biological signature, humanoid but not quite human. Think of it as human with optional extras, like those deluxe sandwich packages they used to sell on Earth stations. Speaking of which, have I mentioned that your coffee supplies are running dangerously low? Because I feel this is information you should have before we potentially host our first dinner party in 18 months. The docking sequence took nearly an hour, partly because the approaching vessel's navigation systems were failing catastrophically, and partly because Malik had to manually override 17 safety protocols that were designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. By the time the battered ship limped into his docking bay, he was genuinely amazed it had held together long enough to complete the approach. The airlock cycled with a wheeze that suggested the station's atmospheric systems were equally surprised by this development. When the inner door opened, Malik found himself face to face with someone who made his breath catch in his throat for reasons he couldn't immediately identify. She was humanoid, definitely female, and would have passed for human at first glance if not for the elongated ears that swept back from her skull in graceful curves. Her dark hair was matted with sweat and what looked like engine coolant, and her clothes were the kind of practical jumpsuit that spoke of long months in cramped spacecraft. But it was her eyes that stopped Malik cold. They held a depth of exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue into something that touched the soul. She swayed on her feet, caught herself against the airlock frame, and looked up at him with an expression that somehow managed to combine desperation, dignity, and bone-deep weariness. "Please," she said in accented standard, the word carrying the weight of 1,000 unsuccessful attempts. "I ask for breeding partnership or quick death. Choose with mercy." Newton's voice filled the sudden silence with characteristic inappropriateness. "Well, Captain, this is either the beginning of a very interesting romantic comedy or a very depressing documentary about interspecies relations. Possibly both. Shall I prepare the guest quarters or the airlock ejection sequence?" Malik ignored his AI's commentary, focusing instead on the woman who was clearly fighting to remain upright. Her request had been delivered with the formal cadence of a ritual phrase, something she'd obviously said many times before to many different people. The resignation in her voice suggested she'd received the same answer repeatedly. "Let's start with you sitting down before you fall down," Malik said gently, stepping forward to offer his arm for support. "Everything else can wait until you've had some food and rest." Her eyes widened with surprise, as if kindness without immediate demands was something she'd forgotten could exist. She allowed him to guide her to the small medical bay, where he ran basic diagnostic scans while she sat in exhausted silence. The readings told a story that made Malik's stomach clench with sympathy. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, and stress markers that suggested months of constant anxiety. Her biological signature registered as Kalari, a species he recognized from xenological databases, but had never encountered in person. "When did you last eat?" he asked, preparing a nutrient infusion, Time moves strangely between stars, she replied, then seemed to make an effort to be more precise. Perhaps 6 days, 7. My ship's food processors failed in the Vega system. Malik's hands stilled on the medical equipment. The Vega system was 3 weeks away at standard cruise speed. She'd been surviving on emergency rations and recycled water for longer than should have been possible. Newton, prepare a meal, something gentle on the digestive system. Right away, Captain. Though I should mention that our guest's biometric readings suggest she's been through more than just food shortages. Her stress hormone levels are off the charts, and I'm detecting cellular damage consistent with prolonged space exposure. This lady has been through what humans would technically term a very bad time. Over the next several hours, as the woman, who eventually introduced herself as Zara, slowly recovered from the immediate effects of starvation and exhaustion, fragments of her story began to emerge. The Kalari were a dying species, victims of a stellar catastrophe that had destroyed their home system and scattered the survivors across the galaxy in desperate diaspora. We were perhaps 3 million before the star died, Zara explained, accepting her third bowl of synthesized protein soup with the careful gratitude of someone who'd learned not to take food for granted. Now we are maybe 3,000 scattered like seeds across the dark, our genes. She paused, searching for the right words in standard. Our genes grow thin. Without new bloodlines, we fade into nothing. Malik was beginning to understand the cultural context behind her initial request. For a species facing extinction, reproduction wasn't just personal. It was a desperate biological imperative that had apparently been codified into ritual. So your people send out individuals to find genetic compatibility with other species. Zara's laugh held no humor. Send out? No, we beg, we plead. We offer ourselves to any who might preserve something of what we were. Her elongated ears drooped with shame. I have asked 17 species for partnership, 17 rejections. Most laugh. Some try to use desperation for their pleasure without giving children. A few simply pretend not to hear. Newton's voice broke into the conversation with uncharacteristic gentleness. Captain, I'm detecting elevated stress responses in our guest. Perhaps we should discuss lighter topics. For instance, did you know that in pre-space Earth entertainment, this exact scenario was the premise for approximately 47% of all romantic comedies, though they usually involved less existential despair and more amusing misunderstandings about wedding preparations. Despite everything, Zara's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. Your AI watches ancient human entertainment. Newton has some unusual interests, Malik said diplomatically. His humor algorithms seem to have developed a fascination with Earth cultural artifacts from the 20th and 21st centuries. I prefer to think of it as anthropological research, Newton replied with digital dignity. Though I admit my analysis of human mating rituals has been largely theoretical until now. This is quite exciting from a sociological perspective. Zara looked between Malik and his AI with growing bewilderment, as if she'd stumbled into something far different from her previous encounters. Malik realized that her desperate journey had probably brought her into contact with the worst aspects of galactic civilization: exploitation, cruelty, indifference. His small research station, with its quirky AI and solitary human operator, must seem like an entirely different universe. Why do you show kindness without price? She asked suddenly, the question carrying the weight of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of generosity. Malik considered his answer carefully. The truth was that he recognized something in her exhaustion, in the way she carried herself like someone who'd been disappointed too many times to hope anymore. It was a feeling he knew intimately from his own years of voluntary exile in the deep black. Because you asked for help, he said simply. And because you're here and you're hungry, and those are the only reasons I need. Through the station's viewports, the stars of the Andromeda Drift painted the universe in familiar patterns. and Malik realized that, for the first time in months, his research station felt less like a hermitage and more like a home with an unexpected guest who might, perhaps, become something more. Zara spent her first week aboard Research Station Kepler-7 like a wild creature, slowly learning to trust. She would appear in the common areas during meal times, accept food with quiet gratitude, then retreat to the guest quarters Malik had prepared for her. He caught glimpses of her sometimes, standing at the observation deck's massive viewport, staring out at the stars with an expression that seemed to hold the weight of entire extinct worlds. Newton, meanwhile, had appointed himself unofficial director of what he called Operation Cultural Exchange, which mostly involved him providing running commentary on human social customs that he'd gleaned from his extensive database of Earth entertainment. Captain, I've been analyzing interaction patterns from approximately 3,000 romantic comedies, and I believe the next step in this process involves what humans call meaningful conversation over coffee. Though I should note that 73% of these scenarios also involved someone spilling said coffee at a crucial emotional moment. Newton, this isn't a romantic comedy, Malik said, reviewing stellar cartography data while keeping half an ear on his AI's observations. Of course not, Captain. It's far more interesting. We have an alien refugee, a lonely human scientist, and a vast backdrop of cosmic indifference. It's like one of those independent films that win awards for being emotionally devastating yet ultimately hopeful. Malik was beginning to suspect that Newton's obsession with Earth entertainment was actually a sophisticated form of psychological analysis. The AI had an uncanny ability to identify patterns in human behavior that Malik himself often missed. The breakthrough in communication came during Zara's second week, when Malik found her in the station's small hydroponics bay, staring at the growing plants with something approaching wonder. "We had gardens like this," she said without turning around, her voice soft with memory. "Before the star died, our cities grew food in towers that reached toward the sky. My mother tended fruit trees that bloomed in colors your language has no words for." Malik moved to stand beside her, careful not to crowd her space. "What was your world called?" "Keltharis, the singing world." She reached out to touch a tomato plant's leaves with gentle fingers. "The crystals in our mountains resonated with stellar radiation, creating music that could be heard across continents. We built our cities to harmonize with the planetary song." Over the following days, Zara's story emerged in fragments. A civilization that had achieved a delicate balance between technology and artistry, destroyed in a matter of hours when their primary star went supernova earlier than any stellar model had predicted. The survivors had fled in whatever ships they could construct, carrying with them genetic samples, cultural artifacts, and the desperate hope that they could preserve something of their people among the stars. "The first years were hopeful," Zara explained one evening as they shared dinner in the station's small galley. "We found worlds to settle, established colonies began to rebuild, but the children—" Her elongated ears drooped with sorrow. "Each generation was smaller than the last. Our genetic diversity was too narrow. We needed new bloodlines or we would simply fade away like a song ending." Newton had been uncharacteristically quiet during these conversations, but finally spoke up. "Zara, if I may ask, what happens to individuals who are unsuccessful in finding genetic partnerships?" The question hung in the recycled air of the station like a challenge. Zara's hands stilled on her eating utensils, and Malik saw something close to fear flicker across her features. "We have a tradition," she said carefully. "If a seeker cannot find partnership after sufficient attempts, they may choose the final journey. Walk into space without a suit, return to the void that gave birth to..." The arrival of the Kelari delegation was announced by proximity alarms that had become depressingly familiar over the past month. Malik and Zara were in the middle of what Newton had dubbed Advanced Interspecies Philosophy Hour, a daily discussion that had evolved from basic cultural exchange into something approaching genuine intellectual partnership, when the station's sensors detected 3 ships approaching from the direction of the Sigma Draconis system. "Well," Newton announced with characteristic understatement, "this should be interesting. I'm reading Kalari biosignatures on all 3 vessels, and their communication protocols are broadcasting what my translation algorithms interpret as either formal diplomatic inquiry or really aggressive dinner invitation. The linguistic ambiguity is causing my humor subroutines to malfunction." Zara had gone perfectly still at the announcement, her elongated ears pressed flat against her skull in what Malik had learned was a sign of extreme distress. Through the observation port, the approaching ships resolved into sleek, crystalline designs that seemed to sing with barely contained energy, beautiful and somehow ominous at the same time. "They found me," Zara whispered, the words carrying the weight of inevitability. "Who found you?" Malik asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The Council of Last Hope, the elders who coordinate our people's survival efforts." She stood abruptly, pacing to the viewport to stare at the approaching vessels. "They must have been tracking my journey, monitoring my failures. If they're here, it means they've decided my time is over." Newton's voice carried an unusual note of concern. "Zara, could you clarify what time being over means in this context? Because my threat assessment protocols are suggesting several possibilities, and most of them involve significantly more drama than I'm prepared to handle on a Tuesday." The lead ship docked with the smooth precision that spoke of advanced navigation systems and experienced pilots. As the airlock cycled, Malik found himself unconsciously moving closer to Zara, a protective instinct he hadn't realized he possessed asserting itself. The delegation consisted of 3 Kalari, their elongated ears adorned with ceremonial rings that marked them as individuals of significant authority. The leader was elderly even by Kalari standards, her silver hair elaborately braided, and her dark eyes holding the kind of weariness that came from making impossible decisions for the survival of others. "I am Thexhai of the Council of Last Hope," she announced in heavily accented standard, her gaze fixed on Zara with an expression that combined disappointment and something that might have been pity. "We have come for the wanderer who has brought shame upon her bloodlines through persistent failure." "Shame?" Malik stepped forward before he could stop himself. "She's been traveling for months, facing rejection and exploitation while carrying the genetic heritage of your people. How exactly is that shameful?" Thexhai's attention shifted to Malik with the kind of assessment that made him feel like a specimen under examination. "You are the human who has harbored our failure. Do you claim partnership with this one, or do you merely delay the inevitable with misplaced kindness?" The question hung in the station's recycled air like a challenge. Malik felt Zara's eyes on him, and through their weeks of growing closeness, he could sense her tension. This wasn't just about their relationship, it was about her right to exist. "I claim friendship with Zara," Malik said carefully, "and I question any cultural system that defines a person's worth solely by their reproductive success." One of the other council members, younger, with the kind of fervent intensity that often characterized true believers, spoke up with obvious irritation. "You understand nothing of our situation, human. We are 3,000 souls scattered across the galaxy, growing fewer with each passing year. Every individual who cannot contribute to genetic continuity hastens our extinction. And what about individuals who could contribute in other ways?" Newton interjected, his vocal processors modulated to their most diplomatically respectful settings. "Cultural preservation, technological innovation, artistic expression. Are these things without value to a dying civilization?" Thexhai's ears twitched at the AI's words, a sign that Malik had learned indicated deep consideration. "You speak of luxuries, machine. When a species faces extinction, only survival matters." "Does it?" Zara's voice was quiet but carried a strength that surprised everyone present, including herself. "Thexhai, I have seen 17 species during my journey. some thriving, some struggling, some clinging to existence by threads thinner than ours. Do you know what distinguishes those who adapt from those who simply endure until they fade? The elder Kailari's expression sharpened with interest despite herself. Enlighten us, wanderer. The ones who survive are the ones who remember that survival is not the same as living, Zara continued, her confidence growing with each word. We have become so focused on preserving our genetic patterns that we have forgotten what made those patterns worth preserving in the first place. The fervent council member made a sound of disgust. Pretty words will not birth children or restore our lost worlds. No, Malik agreed, surprising the Kalari. But maybe they'll help you build something worth inheriting instead of just something that carries your DNA. What followed was a debate that stretched across several days, with philosophical arguments that ranged from the practical mechanics of species preservation to the fundamental question of what constituted cultural continuity. Newton, apparently convinced that the situation called for his full repertoire of Earth cultural references, began offering increasingly bizarre comparisons to human entertainment. If I may reference the ancient Earth documentary series Star Trek, Newton announced during a particularly heated exchange about genetic diversity, they had an entire episode about a species that tried to preserve itself through enforced breeding programs. It ended badly, very badly. Lots of ethical questions about individual autonomy versus species survival. That was fiction, Thexhai replied dryly. So is the idea that you can maintain a viable civilization by threatening suicide for anyone who doesn't immediately find a reproductive partner, Newton countered with unusual bluntness. The breakthrough came when Zara made a proposal that none of them had anticipated. Using Malik's communication equipment and her own knowledge of Kalari diaspora networks, she contacted other scattered communities of their people, asking a simple question. How many individuals had chosen the final journey not because they couldn't contribute to their people's future, but because they had been convinced that genetic reproduction was the only contribution that mattered? The answers that came back over the following weeks painted a picture that made even Thexhai's certainty waver. Engineers who had taken the final journey, rather than burden communities with their inability to bear children. Artists whose cultural contributions had been deemed irrelevant. Scientists whose research into adaptation and survival had been dismissed as impractical dreaming. We have been killing our future to preserve our past, Zara said quietly as the last of the responses came in. How many solutions have we lost? How many innovations? How many ways of seeing the universe that might have shown us paths we never considered? Thexhai was silent for a long moment, her ancient eyes studying the data streams that told the story of opportunities lost to rigid thinking. What do you propose, Wanderer? Stop calling me Wanderer, Zara replied with a strength that made Malik's chest tight with something he was finally ready to name as love. My name is Zara, and I propose that we stop treating our people like genetic resources and start treating them like the brilliant, creative, adaptable beings they are. The plan that emerged from their discussions was radical by Kalari standards but pragmatic by galactic ones. Instead of sending individuals on desperate quests for genetic compatibility, they would establish cultural and technological exchange programs with other species. Instead of defining worth solely through reproduction, they would create value through innovation, artistry, and adaptive problem-solving. Instead of threats and shame, they would offer choice and opportunity. As the council prepared to depart with their revolutionary new mandate, Thexhai paused at the airlock to address Malik directly. Human, you have given us more than you know. Not just shelter for one lost daughter, but perspective on what it means to preserve the future. After the ships departed, Malik and Zara stood together on the observation deck, watching the crystalline vessels disappear into the star field. The silence between them held the weight of possibilities that neither had dared to articulate until now. So, Newton announced with the timing of a born comedian, Now that we've solved the existential crisis of an entire species, perhaps we should discuss what happens next. Because my analysis suggests that two individuals who have just revolutionized interstellar cultural policy might have some personal matters to address. Zara's laugh was soft and full of something that might have been joy. Your AI is very direct. Newton has his moments, Malik agreed, taking her hand in his. But he's not wrong. We should probably talk about what comes next. Through the viewport, the Andromeda Drift painted the universe in patterns of light and possibility. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Zara looked at the future and saw hope instead of desperation. 6 months after the Council of Last Hope's departure, Research Station Kepler-7 had transformed from Malik's solitary refuge into something resembling an interstellar social services center. The changes had begun small. A communication array upgrade here, additional living quarters there. But as word of the Kelari cultural revolution spread through the galaxy's network of displaced beings, Malik's quiet research station had become an unexpected beacon of hope for the lost and abandoned. Newton, who had appointed himself as both official greeter and unofficial therapist for their growing collection of refugees, seemed to be thriving in his new role. Captain, I'm pleased to report that our guest roster now includes 2 more Kelari individuals who were previously marked for final journey. One Zephyrian family whose children were rejected by their birth colony for genetic anomalies, and 3 humans who were apparently exiled for the crime of falling in love with the wrong people. It's like we're running a romantic comedy crossed with a United Nations refugee camp. Malik looked up from the engineering report he'd been reviewing, plans for expanding the station's capacity to accommodate their growing population of galactic misfits. How are the integration protocols working? Surprisingly well. It turns out that beings who have been rejected by their own societies for not fitting conventional molds have a remarkable capacity for accepting each other's differences. Though I should mention that the Zephyrian children have discovered they can make the station's crystals sing by touching them in specific patterns, which is either delightful or deeply concerning, depending on your perspective on unsupervised alien children with psychokinetic abilities. Zara emerged from the communication center, her expression mixing excitement with the kind of exhaustion that came from coordinating complex interstellar logistics. Over the past months, she had evolved from desperate refugee to something approaching an ambassador for a new kind of galactic community, one built on inclusion rather than exclusion, adaptation rather than rigid tradition. The Tau Ceti colony has agreed to host 3 more Kelari families, she reported, settling into the chair beside Malik's desk with the casual intimacy that had developed between them. And the research installation at Proxima Centauri wants to know if we can recommend any xenobiologists who specialize in cross-species agricultural techniques. I might know someone, Malik said with a slight smile, gesturing to the stack of research proposals that covered his desk. His own work had expanded far beyond stellar cartography into the complex challenges of creating sustainable communities for beings who didn't quite fit anywhere else. Their relationship had evolved naturally, without the desperate urgency that had marked Zara's original proposition. What had grown between them was deeper than genetic compatibility or cultural mandate. It was the recognition of 2 souls who had found in each other not just companionship, but a shared purpose that neither could have imagined alone. Newton, Zara called. What's the status on the adoption center proposal? The AI's response came with unusual pride. Officially approved by the Galactic Relations Council as of this morning. Congratulations, you two. You are now the proud operators of the first licensed interspecies family services center in the Andromeda Drift. I've taken the liberty of designing official letterhead featuring a logo that I believe captures the appropriate combination of professionalism and heartwarming sentiment. The adoption center had been Zara's idea, born from watching the various displaced families who passed through their station trying to create new connections across species barriers. Children orphaned by wars, adults rejected by communities that couldn't accept their choices, elderly beings whose cultures had vanished into history, all finding ways to build families that transcended the traditional boundaries of biology and species. Their first official case had been the Zephyrian family with psychokinetic children, matched with a human couple who had spent decades studying paranormal phenomena. The second had been even more unusual, an elderly Kalari artist who had been facing final journey for her inability to bear children, paired with a young human engineer whose own family had disowned him for refusing to follow their military traditions. The unlikely partnership had produced innovations in crystalline technology that were already revolutionizing interstellar communication. Captain Zara Newton interrupted their review of case files with the tone he reserved for significant announcements. "We have incoming vessels. 3 ships, Kalari configuration, but these aren't council ships. The energy signatures suggest civilian transports." Malik and Zara exchanged glances. Over the past months, they had received numerous Kalari visitors, some bringing news of the cultural changes rippling through their scattered communities, others seeking advice on implementing the new approaches to survival and continuity. The ships docked with the graceful precision that characterized Kalari technology, but the beings who emerged were unlike any delegation they had received before. These were families, parents with children, elderly couples,